In this lesson, we're going to discuss alpha and influence of environment. Alright, so let's open up our material editor and let's switch over to the alpha panel. Now you'll see here that there's really not a whole lot to our alpha production. It's going to look very similar to our simple material alpha. So we can drive it by a function just by double clicking on it and choosing a function. And then we could also drive that by its filter here. Let's go back to our materials to mix. Let's switch the alpha to 0.25 across all of these here. All right. And we can begin to mix these materials together more and more here if you want to. And the alpha is just going to control our transparencies here. Now in any area that is black, that is going to be transparent, and any area that's going to be white is going to be visible. Now with that, let's move on to the influence of environment. So we see here the first thing that we need to do is actually allow the distribution of materials dependent on local slope, altitude, and orientation. So you can see we have influence of altitude, influence of slope, and then influence of orientation. Now the influence of altitude is going to be dependent on whether you are going to have material to appear at higher altitudes or at lower altitudes. And we can begin to mix those influences by using this slider. So the first thing that I need to determine is, do I want my red color to be at a higher altitude or at a lower altitude? I'm going to go ahead and have it at a lower altitude. So my red is my material 1, so my blue is material 2. So I want that to appear at high altitudes. Now I can adjust the strength of my material 2 based on this strength slider here. So I can adjust this down, and we're going to get a little bit more blue at the bottom. Now if I adjust this up toward the top, I'm going to get more blue at the top here and less at the bottom. Now if I switch this and I say at low altitudes, we're going to flip those colors there. So now if I have 100% strong, we're going to have red up at the top here. Okay, we've just inverted it there. So a really neat way of mixing these materials. Now we have altitude by range. We can do by object, we can do by material, absolute, or relative to area. Now altitude range, we usually want to do by object because that's what we're trying to apply the material to itself. So we want to use its altitude and not necessarily the altitude of our material. Okay. Now we have influence of slope. And this works the exact same way. Do we want material 2 to appear on flat surfaces, or do we want it to appear on steep surfaces? So I'm going to say on steep. And you'll see that this is appearing almost all over this entire material here. Let's go ahead and adjust this, and let's drop the strength down, and we're going to see more and more of that red there. Let's hit OK on this and do a quick render and just kind of see what this is looking like, because you really can't get a good idea of how the material is going to react based on how it's looking on the material swatch. Okay, we always want to take a look at what it looks like on the object. So we're getting a lot of blue on most of this object here. So I want to switch this to where the blue is more on the flat surfaces rather than the steep surfaces. So I'm going to hit Escape. And let's open up the material editor. Let's switch this to on flat surfaces. Let's bump our strength up a little bit more. And let's hit OK. And quick render. And it's showing up on all of these flatter surfaces. Now, we might be a little confused on how this is working, because we have influence of slope, and then we also have influence of orientation. And we're going to be able to get more red on these flatter surfaces here by using that method there. So let's hit Escape. Let's go to our material editor, and let's use the influence of orientation. So material 2 needs to appear on some of the flatter surfaces here. So let's just adjust our strength here. And you'll see that this is covering up most of our material. Let's adjust this to where we get a little bit more red. So let's go to about 240. Let's hit OK. And let's do a quick render of that. And it doesn't look like we're really getting any red in here. It's mostly just blue. So that's what I'm talking about whenever we need to do a render first before we begin. Let's open up that material editor again. And let's bring this down. Let's go to 10. And let's hit OK and do a quick render of that. And here we can see that the blue is going to show up on areas that are within 10 degrees. If it goes over that, it's not going to apply that material there. So we're going to go with our material 1 with that red color. All right. Now let's hit escape. Let's go to our material editor. And we have a coordinate system. We can use the world orientation or we can use the object orientation. Now we're going to get a different result out of this. So let's hit OK. Let's render that. And you'll see that we get a little bit more red in here. Okay, so I always find that it's a little bit better and I have a little more control if I use the object orientation instead of my world orientation. Now these are some kind of weird colors, and what I want to do now is show you how we can load materials and then begin to mix those together. So let's bring up our material editor and let's go into our materials to mix. And let's select material 1. I'm going to reset its color. And then I'm going to double click on this material and load in a different material here. And actually, let's go back to material 1. Let's click on load and choose something different. So let's go to, let's see, let's go up here. Let's see if we can find landscapes. Let's put material 1 as, let's do natural 3 here. And then I'm going to go into material 2. I'm going to load in one there. And let's do something a little rockier. Let's try rocks and plants here. All right. Now you can see how this material is mixing. Now I can begin to adjust how it's mixing, so I can have material 1 more prominent than material 2, or I can do just the opposite of that. Okay, so I really like material 1. Okay, now this is the global control. Now once we start getting into the influence of environment, they still have to adhere to these rules that we've put in place up here. So if I say influence of altitude, I want my material 2 to appear at higher altitudes. I'm going to make that a strong influence, so we'll do 80%. Our influence of slope, I want that to that material to appear at higher altitudes and also at flatter surfaces. So we'll make that a really strong influence. And actually, let's type in 100, not 10. There we go. And then we have influence of orientation. So if we want material 2 to appear at smaller slopes or orientation, we want to have that number pretty low there. Let's drop this at 80% or so. Let's give that a little bit of a variation. So now if I hit OK, I'll do a quick render of this. You'll see that we'll get mostly rock and grass here, or of that natural 3 material, and then spread throughout some of the tops at higher altitudes on flatter surfaces and less of an orientation. We're going to get that rock and grass or rock and plant material in there. So you can begin to experiment with how you're going to use that influence of environment. And it's a really neat control, because then you can start to control things like how mountains, they're really rocky. And then in areas that we want them to have snow, we can have those at higher altitudes. And then we can have that appear on flatter surfaces and less acute orientation angles. So that way it appears right on top and not in cracks and things like that. All right, so we've taken a look at how we can mix materials, all three of those panels that are in there. And remember that the main thing that you should pay attention to in mixing materials is going to be how it's created in the hierarchy here. Okay, so you navigate here, and then you start with your mixing proportions, and then start to come in here and tell it what materials to mix. You can use an alpha if you like. Okay, tell it how to distribute these materials, and then you can also do your influence of environment. All right. Now, in our next lesson, we're going to begin getting into volumetric materials. So we're just going to move right down the line here, and we're going to talk about how we can create materials for clouds and things like that. So I'll see you then.